Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you know that I'm always like devastatingly on time, so please take your seats because we shall start right about now. And I'm very glad to see you all here today. My name is Paola Antonelli, and I've been happily running these salons for the past 10 years. We're at number 43. And with me is Cristina Moschul, who is an extraordinary R&D associate. You know, we change the title sometimes, but in truth, she's the brain and I'm the brawn. So I'm very happy to see you all here for number 43, salon number 43. Those who are looking on at us, watching online, also welcome. This salon is on traces. As you know, the whole concept of R&D is to try and prove to the world that museums can be the R&D of society. And in order to do so, we try to pick topics that are extremely important and relevant to the world at large. What is important to us today? What is always in the back and in the front of our minds? Truth, the reliability of information, the kind of apathy or information apocalypse, as the New York Times called it, that is facing us every day. So how can we as curators, as artists, as scholars, as journalists, help ourselves and the rest of the world deal with this situation? Well, we can try and inspire people to be better investigators, to start and read the traces themselves instead of just relying on the interpretation of the traces that is offered by others. So tonight we're going to talk about exactly this topic. What are traces? What do they represent? And how do we help people? No, I don't have the glasses, so I have to put them on first. And how do we help people deal with them? What you're looking here is one of Daniel Spurry, the Swiss artist's Snare photographs, in which he photographs the aftermath of a dinner. And you can see, you can read from the traces of the dinner, not only what people ate, but also a lot about eating habits, about socializing patterns, about duration, etiquette norms. I'm always thinking of Thorstein Veblen, Civilization of Good Manners. You can kind of see a lot from these traces. Depends, however, on what you're looking for. And that's one of the biggest question marks. How do we know what to look for? And how do we know what we are looking at? There's a lot that we can deduct, but also a lot that we need to know in advance in order to read the traces in the right way, to read the tea leaves. And at the same time, we can also think of investigation. And what you're looking at here is a drawing by Sarah Wigglesworth, who's an architect, that in a way traces all the micro movements and the latent information that certain dynamics that might have happened and that have happened are inferred by in the traces that are left. So tracing as a methodology and traces as content is what we will discuss tonight. And of course, we'll discuss also their relationship to truth. There was an article lately in the New York Times that talked about the ways to recognize deep fakes. And there was this fabulous piece that was done by artist, wait a second, what was his name? Oh yeah, Dan Lytle for the New York Times, exactly. And it was deep fakes and construction. So is AI the end of truth? Well, maybe, but it could be also the beginning, because as we will see, the way to read traces is informed also by how people are trained. And training is also what is at the basis of AI. Interestingly, if you've read some of the articles that we've sent you, you'll realize that there are a lot of traces that are read by people that have not only intuition, but also a pre-established culture. It's almost like diagnostics. It's almost like Dr. House. And it made me think of the fact that one of the best applications of AI so far has been diagnostics. So there's hope also in the way we will use AI to combat our information apocalypse. But you know, AI was not the beginning of this crisis of truth. We can go back to the 19th century and the end of the Franco-Prussian War, when the communards were defeated, and many images that were anti-communards were distributed everywhere. So this is from 1871, and it's Ernest Eugène Appert, a photographer, that completely reconstructed this event. He was not there. So he took a picture of the space, of the street. He engaged actors, and then he stuck the pictures, the faces of the communards on top of the faces of the actors. So this is completely a deep fake, and it was banned by the French government, not because it was untrue, but because it would disturb the public peace, recognizing, therefore, the propaganda value and danger of deep fakes. Doesn't it sound familiar? It's something that, so it really is fantastic to see that nothing is new and that things, this kind of untrustworthiness of representation continues. Because every time we're not witnessing something, and sometimes even when we are, we tend to doubt, especially today in our cynical era, its truthfulness. Well, of course, you remember when man, because it was man, stepped on the moon and stomped on the moon, this image became really universal and also started a million conspiracy theories. And so did the Yeti picture on the Everest in 1951, when an expedition of UK explorers published this image of this like weird monster that was part of the lore of the Sherpas, but that nobody had ever seen. So it's not new at all. And this stunning video will show you even more.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice.
Really a deep fake. Apparently, Richard Nixon had prepared the other speech and never delivered it, of course. And these two artists, Halsey Bergen and Francesca Panetta, created a deep fake speech in which Richard Nixon talks about the death of the astronauts on the moon. So it really is amazing what can be done. And these artists did it on purpose to talk about the role of deep fakes in our information systems. Trustworthiness is really key. And archives are built with this idea of trustworthiness, but at the same time, they control information in such a way that does not make it trustworthy. Quite the opposite. It actually controls it and legitimizes it, but does not really make it universal. Because not everything or person yields traces that can so easily enter Western modes of archiving and therefore producing histories. So archives are not a guarantee of truth, as can be testimonied by Aisha Azoulay, the great scholar that is up at Brown, who talked about many different topics, but in particular talked about this idea of unshowable photographs. So she was looking for these pictures of Palestinians between 1947 and 1951, where they were displaced or actually deported, and she accessed this archive in Geneva at the Red Cross, but the archive, which was open to the public, would give permission for the photographs to be published only if they could actually approve of the text that went with the photographs. So you see, there was a picture that had as a title, Repatriation of 1,200 Arab Civilians, 1949. And instead, Ariella wanted to call it, this is not repatriation, but deportation. Not being able to do so, she retraced the photograph. So retracing really as a method to get to truth is what we are trying to help people also learn. Nothing has happened, nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. You know, this is something that we need to help people understand and to help people retrace. We go from the idea of the methodology to the fact that everything leaves a trace. And Edmond Locard, who was the great French Sherlock Holmes at the beginning of the 20th century, wrote this police technique manual and was the first to talk about digital prints. So you see here this idea of factuality and of retraceability of any sign of life is something that we can also find in other experiments. I really love this experiment. I don't know if Kevin is here tonight, but this experiment by Kevin Slave and Elizabeth Enaff and David Benjamin at the Storefront of Architecture a few years ago that was about the microbiome of the city, about retracing the microbiome of the city. And you see here an image that shows how that representation is very close to that of a fingerprint. Just so you know, there's a microbiome for every subway stop in New York City. So I could take a swab of you and tell you where you take the subway every morning, and you don't want to know, you don't want to have more details, but there is really a sign for everything. And not only in cities, but also in the desert. Another great scholar, Samia Henny, talked a lot about the desert, about the fact that it's a colonial construct to think that the desert is empty. Any kind of empty label given to territories is a colonial predisposition. It's the idea that it's only there to be replenished by the civilization of the colonizer. But in truth, there are traces in the desert, and this amazing picture of the Algerian Sahara shows French nuclear experiments from the past century that are still left there. So it really is important to be able to read all the traces. Today, we will also hear in video from Lawrence Abu Hamdan about the possibility of listening to past lives. All of those crimes that have been perpetrated through generations that are lost because the people are lost maybe can be re-evoked. I mean, this is a performance that he did here at the Museum of Modern Art in June of last year, actually June of this year. So traces of a past life, and what is the work required to get a society to socially accept this as a form of truth. So much of our attention is going in that direction these days. We move now from the traces that have been left for us to find to the traces that we leave for others or for ourselves sometimes to find. You know, the whole idea of reading the tea leaves or following the breadcrumbs comes from the Hansel and Gretel novel. And it really symbolizes this idea of leaving traces for our future selves, as does the idea of the time capsule. This is one of the most famous ones, the Massachusetts State House time capsule. So it's the idea that we want to be able to retrace where we were, what we were doing at that particular time, and maybe also social media are a little bit something similar. So it's fascinating to see that we really try to leave traces of ourselves. And we also try to send traces to other species that we don't know yet. We try to send traces to space, you know, the famous golden ratio record and more. So we really believe that traces are a way to communicate, a way to live truth, and a way to gain truth. And I really would like to end the presentation with this beautiful quote by Eduardo Cadava. To say that history withdraws from sight or understanding is not to say that history is what is past, but rather that it passes away. Not that it has disappeared, but rather that it threatens to disappear. It is always on the verge of disappearing, without disappearing. The possibility of history is bound to the survival of the traces of what is past and to our ability to read these traces as traces. And I would like today to dedicate this salon to the life and work of Dr. Maya Bhatia, a geobiologist, I never get the definition right, but a wonderful scholar and researcher that died in a glacier in the northernmost region of Canada just a few weeks ago, and was a really dear, dear friend of one of our speakers today, and who dedicated her life to finding traces. And there are so many people that do that spend their life investigating traces, and we need to thank them, even though they might not be the superstars that we see on TV at night. They are the superstars that make our lives possible. So it's dedicated to her. And the wonderful panel of speakers that we have tonight, you know, you've read all the biographies, so I won't go into details, but they are superstars in their own field, which is very different. Christian is an investigative journalist at the New York Times for the visual investigation team. Crystal is a multimedia artist. Jorge is a scholar and an architect and the director of the preservation, historical preservation program at Columbia University. Sarah is a biologist, a geochemist, an astronomer, and a planetary scientist. And Susan, well, Susan is a documentary photographer and the president of the Magnum Foundation, and so much more. And they will come to this subject of traces from many different angles, as will our video investigators, Christina Varvia, who's one of the founders of forensic architecture in London, Lawrence Abu Habdan, who's an artist and private ear, and Katja Heitman, who's a choreographer, Dragan Espenscheid, who's the preservation director at Rhizome, and Stefan Helmreich, professor of anthropology at MIT, and Susan Schupli, director of the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths. So it's going to be a great night, and then there's going to be you. So you start preparing your questions. As usual, there will be too many. So we will start right now with a video from Christina Varvia. Please get it going.
Edmund Lockhart, who is commonly referred to Edmund Lockhart, who is commonly referred to as the father of forensic science, devised a principle that states that every contact leaves a trace. A trace is evidence of an encounter, an exchange, or an interaction in that way. So how do we then read such traces in order to figure out what happened in a moment of conflict or of heightened, complexified politics? Simply, we let matter speak to us. We read the fabric of buildings, the cracks on the walls, the shattering of glass, or the way the burn marks on grass indicate the memory of an event. We follow traces that let us connect objects, actors, and actions in time and space. We notice the way the ground testifies to the presence of heavy armored vehicles, for example, or the way the sea reflects light in a particular way, revealing the presence of oil from industrial spillage. In the words of Susan Schupli, we let matter speak to us as a material witness. Often our eyes, ears, and noses are not enough to capture the traces of an event. We then require the assistance of our non-human kin. We use machinic eyes as prosthetic organs, and vegetal or animal sentience as a proxy to detect the effects of forces that might be too subtle or too slow for us to see. This is what Eyal Weizmann and Matthew Fuller call investigative aesthetics. We get aestheticized to our environment as a means of expanding our political register. And this network of entities with different sentient capacities to traces offer us hyper-aesthetics, the amplification of our own perception. A final thought I want to leave you with is that something, an object or an event of some sort, means that our world expands to include this particular encounter. A trace reveals not only the memory of something that was there or something that happened, but the way that the contact has altered our state, the way these interactions set us in a process of becoming something that we were simply not before the encounter. Investigative aesthetics, therefore, includes the careful study of all the entangled material interactions that not only exist elsewhere, but trace back to us as we affect and get affected by others intimately. Thank you.
Christina. And now I would like to call to the podium, please, Christian Tribert.
Paula, Christina, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great honor, and thank you all for being here. When I heard, Paula, that you want to start on time, I have a tendency of being late. People that know me know that. So sorry for those of you that I seem to cut the line or rushed behind you to get in. I was just worried that I would be late here. Where can I find a pointer for... Oh, this is a pointer. Nice.
So if you want the laser, it's here.
Okay.
That it looks like a laser. This goes forward, this goes back.
Great. Thank you very much. Tonight I want to show you 4 traces that we, the visual investigations team at the New York Times, have used basically to find out what happened, to hold power to account. And the first one is a visual trace. We're obviously called the visual investigations team, so we want to investigate visual traces. And what you see here is the wrangled metal that was found in a house in Afghanistan that was allegedly bombed. It killed Mohammed Ilyas, seen here, and several of his siblings. In total, 11 children, and the mother were killed. The sole survivor was the father, and he suspected the US was responsible. But in an email to us, to Mohammed, a colleague of ours, the US said, we do not have a record of an airstrike being conducted in this area. They doubled down several times to us. They said there was no relation between the killing of these children and their actions in Afghanistan. But that's very interesting, because if we look at this visual that we have, the visual trace, we can see these pieces of metal, but we can also see a square pattern of 4 bolts. And these are basically steering fins, 4 of them, that are used exclusively by the United States above Afghanistan at the time in 2018. You can see it here on a graphic representation of that bomb. They basically make a dumb bomb that's being dropped from an airplane smart. So with this information and with other information, we presented this to the Pentagon, and they eventually admitted that they did conduct the airstrike that killed these 11 children and a woman. Now, a visual trace can be very obvious, but sometimes we need to look further, and that's the next trace that I want to show you, an audio trace. In this video that I'm going to show you, you hear gunfire, and you basically have a visual remnant of an incident in which the American-Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh is killed. But the moment that she is killed may have been captured on the video. You don't see who is firing, and that's very important. Let's have a look at that video. So here we can see Shireen Abu Akleh and several of her colleagues all wearing, I'm not sure what's going on, all wearing their press vests, walking. And you hear shots being fired. But you don't see what's happening, right? No worries. Okay, so I have to hold, let me put this here. Apologies. So you hear these shots being fired at this group of journalists. They're clearly marked, but the thing is you only hear the sound. You cannot see who is firing. And actually, when we look at the waveform of the audio, we can see something very interesting. You can see those spikes, right? You can see a big spike, then a pause, then a smaller spike. Big spike, smaller, like pause, smaller spike. And this is what you're looking at, is basically the sound of a bullet leaving the barrel. So let's say I'm standing here, I'm firing a gun, and the video that's capturing this moment is here. That second spike that you're seeing is basically the sound of the bullet near that microphone. So that's very interesting, because these are just milliseconds. But in that way, we can calculate the minimum and maximum range of which these bullets could have been fired. This is very important because the Israeli authorities said, we cannot determine who killed her. It's likely that she was killed by a Palestinian stray bullet, an armed Palestinian man that killed her. So actually, when we can locate that pin on the map, this is where that microphone is located of that video that we saw. And the orange circles are the minimum and maximum range of which that bullet could have been fired. And the only position that made sense of which you could have been killed was the position of an Israeli military vehicle, which we knew based on security camera footage. So eventually Israel admitted that they were responsible for the killing of her. Sometimes we don't have a visual or an audio trace, but just indirect traces. And that's what we see here. We see bullet holes, and this is the apartment of Breonna Taylor, who was killed by police. And the public was impeded of knowing what exactly happened because all these 7 police officers that raided her house had switched off their body camera. So there was no visual and no audio of the moment that they killed her. So we obtained all these photos of the apartment which showed where the bullets went. And my colleague made a 3D model of all those photos showing where all the bullets were fired. And basically, this showed that it was not around 18 bullets what the police said were fired, but at least 32. And also, the Attorney General had exonerated the person that actually fired the bullet that killed her. But this investigation showed that way more was going on than the police was telling. And later on, that person was on trial. The last example that I want to show is a fake trace. So what we're looking at here is the signal of a ship. We can see these are basically all large ships in the world need to send out a signal where they are, similar like aircraft. And we can follow one of those traces, and this is supposed to be where the ship is. And if we follow this trace, you know, it looks pretty legit. We can see, we can zoom in. But then when I zoom into this point, I can see it's making basically a perfectly circular pattern. So it's like, that's kind of weird. But because almost the entire world is being photographed by satellites nowadays, I can look up the exact moment in time that it's saying the ship is here. And if I compare that with that satellite image of that exact location, I can see there's nothing there. But still, that fake signal of where that ship is leaves a trace. We can see here, and I'm almost done, we can see here the AIS source, Nachotka AIS station. That's where the signal, that fake signal, is being received. That's interesting because that's a port in Russia, and that port in Russia is hundreds of miles away from that fake signal. Those stations can only receive like 30, 40, 50 kilometers, not hundreds of miles away. So then we take a look at these AIS signals. These are all the ships that are saying that they're in that port, and we zoom in with, or we compare it with a satellite image taken at the same time again. We zoom in, we can see 2 ships docked at an oil station, oil terminal, but only one is sending a signal. And when we look closely, we can see that is the Cathay Phoenix, that ship that was sending out that fake signal. And what is interesting is that a tugboat operator that was working in that port also felt like, you know, it's great to show my followers that I'm putting a boat into place. And I was like, this looks like the Cathay Phoenix, but that's not at all. The tugboat operator even posted the name of the ship on Instagram with the hashtag TugLife. This is interesting because this ship was using American insurance to basically transport Russian oil, which is, of course, under a price cap. I hope in this way I've been able to show how we at the Visual Investigations team use different kind of traces to hold power to account. And even though 7 is my favorite number, I think I did like 8 minutes maybe, but I blame the microphone. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. I'll get it back. Now we have a video by Lawrence Abu Hamdan.
There are many commonly repeated misconceptions about sound. Perhaps the most common of all is that you can't close your ears, but you can close your eyes. But I challenge anyone who has ever spent time in a courtroom or attended a dinner with your extended family to argue that ears cannot be shut tight when they need to be. Also, though it is physically true we can close our eyes, there are many things we can't unsee. Many things that our eyelids cannot protect us from. Another just as preposterous myth is that sound leaves no trace, that it is ephemeral and intangible. But as an audio investigator, I spend a great deal of my time with sonic traces. And this work has taught me that sound not only leaves a trace, but that it also acts as a provocation to redefine what a trace is. Through sound, I have learned that the most indelible and significant traces are in fact absences. I spend vast amounts of time measuring decaying frequencies or gaps between echoes, or the silent intervals that straddle samples. Sound may not leave fingerprints, but once we start to search for the kind of traces it does leave behind, we see that the most lasting mark it has is on the way we think about evidence itself.
Call to the podium Crystal Z. Campbell.
Good evening, everyone. You can respond. I am Crystal Campbell. I'm really excited to be here today. I am going to forward with this.
Yeah, the big green.
Okay. So I'm just going to jump right in with that 7-minute mark. This is a project where I was thinking about the cellular trace. This is a project which perhaps affects everyone in this space and everyone that we encounter on a daily basis in some capacity. This is actually a rough diamond that I worked and collaborated with a molecular geneticist on to grow Henrietta Lacks' cells. So this tiny little, I'm going to go back. I don't know if I can. Okay. So this tiny little dot here is actually one of Henrietta Lacks' cells. And for those of you that may not be familiar, Henrietta Lacks' story is very important because Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman whose cells were taken without her consent in the 1950s. And those cells are still used today for biomedical research. They were used to start the first biomedical companies. So there's billions of dollars circulating around the reproduction and cloning of her cells. And I'd like to sort of, think about her cellular material as, not only this research material, but also an archive that is being transmitted on a regular basis. So this is a picture of Henrietta Lacks, photographer unknown. And to the right is a work called Portrait of a Woman 1, Portrait of a Woman 2, where I'm thinking about what constitutes a portrait, particularly for those who are familiar or in the sort of realm of art history. There are numbers of portraits of women or heads of people who are noted in art history texts but unnamed. So I'm thinking a lot in my work around the underloved. And here's that portrait. I'm going to go forward. We can talk more about that later, but I wanted to advance to this project, which is Gorilla Means More. And I was getting ready to leave New York. This was like 2011, I think. I got a residency to a space at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, and I could no longer afford New York, so I took that opportunity. And a friend of mine proposed that we take a walk. And on that walk, she led me to the Slave Theater, which was in Bed-Stuy. And as we trespassed into that building, she continued to show me murals on the wall. And the building was being squatted, so we didn't stay very long. But on the way out, my foot hit something on the floor, which ended up being a 35-millimeter reel of film that was uncanned and unprotected, but also had vinegar syndrome and was prone to all of the sort of residue and detritus of a New York floor that has been neglected for a number of years, as you can imagine. So I shouldn't have instinctively picked it up. But I'd like to think of this work because the building was eventually demolished. It was a Black civil rights theater that was really important and was also where Al Sharpton shifted the sort of Black civil rights movement here in New York from Harlem to Brooklyn. And the film itself, while the building has been demolished, the film itself is a relic of gentrification. Well, these are just two installation versions of the film. And I also am thinking a lot about sort of Diana Taylor. I'm just getting into Diana Taylor's work and thinking about embodiment as an archive. She's sort of decolonizing the very formal and Western and colonial version of the archive and thinking about all of these other versions of embodiment and unwritten record as archival material as well, sort of leaning into the epigenetic lens of the archive. And how am I doing on time, Paola?
Great.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. So I did a residency in Sweden at Art Inside Out a few years back, pre-pandemic. And I was, with the language barrier, we were doing sort of these group visits to archives, and I kept telling the coordinators that I wanted to work with Black residents of Sweden in this town called Varberg, which is known for having the most spas in Sweden. And prior to that, the town used to be a sanatorium for people with tuberculosis. And guess what? Henrietta Lacks's cells were used to help develop the cure for tuberculosis. So the town had to reinvent itself, right? And so I'm also thinking about the way in which Henrietta Lacks's cellular material shifted the sort of geopolitical space of Sweden, of this particular town, as well as many other spaces. And so they kept telling me in the archives there was no material, there was no material. So I decided I would make a film that I wanted to be, one, very performative, thinking about the embodiment as well in transmission, historical transmission, and also this sort of transculturation, not only what people are being assimilated into, but what do they bring to this space that they're now inhabiting. So this film, Viewfinder, is I don't know if I can go back, so I won't. But the film Viewfinder is a document and a record of Black migrants to Sweden in a time where the face of Sweden is changing rapidly. And I have worked a lot around the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, but I will just sort of show you these images of working with archival photographs and collaging and embedding materials in conjunction with those, and thinking about the paint and the thickness of the paint as well as a scar, and thinking about that sort of level, because so much of that history has been silenced and erased for a number of years and only has recently come to the fore, but is also sort of at risk again because of the ban on critical race theory. So I will end there, but thank you so much.
Thank you. The next video is by choreographer Katja Heitmann.
I would like to start by learning you a movement. Please lift up your right hand and stretch your fingers. Yes, everyone stretch your fingers. Now you bring your fingers together so your fingertips are touching each other. You open your fingers again and you close them. You open and close. Continue this movement, but now bring this movement on top of your head. Yes. This movement is from my father. He would always do it when he was thinking deeply, and everyone would recognize him by this movement. My father passed away 5 years ago. However, if you would search the official archives, you would get a very different image of him. What is officially still preserved are his medical papers, his bank account papers, his tax papers, and the last police file. So I was wondering, is this as a society how we want to remember each other? And this is why I started an archive for the most elusive, paradoxical heritage of humankind, our movements. It's called Motus Mori, and in this archive I collect the personal movements from people from all ages, bodies, and backgrounds to create artworks with that. What is important that no technology is used in this archive. All movements are transferred from body to body to body to body. But how can an archive of movements still exist in 100 years, maybe even in 1,000 years? How can we transfer our movements towards the next generation? I have a dream that I want to create a monument of movement. And I would like to ask you to start tonight and take the first step together with me. And learn this movement I just learned to you, this one. Learn it to another person, to another body. Thank you.
And next is a video by Dragan Espenscheid.
Working online for more than 2 decades, at first as a net artist, later as a conservator of net art. And I never had to worry that anything I found relevant would preserve itself and suddenly there would be too much of it. So the common saying, the internet never forgets, is only true for information that is interesting for quite powerful actors to keep. Platforms like Facebook, Google, or Office 365 will remember their users' every keystroke and every banner ad they ever viewed or clicked on. Coordinated harassment campaigns will make sure their targets' embarrassing pictures will keep circulating for as long as possible. Probably photos and videos that can be used to train AIs will be kept around as long as the hype lasts. But for many other things, such as community-operated platforms running on a shoestring budget, or online art, even when commissioned by affluent institutions, there's usually no time to even discuss if somebody should do something about their longevity. A missed credit card payment to a service provider, a single person leaving an organization, a surprising shift in a commercial platform's business model, and a resulting redesign can destroy years' worth of digital culture. Another thing to consider about the original question is who is actually being asked? Who is making the decisions about what is to be forgotten, to keep using that metaphor, and what online places will receive, what kind of preservation actions, are these even effective? So capabilities for preserving online artifacts remain concentrated at a few places where decisions are made about what to keep, perhaps for exploitative reasons, and what to allow to be washed away. And the 5-second summary is, it is of course impossible and meaningless to preserve everything that ever appeared on the web. We should make sure that effective preservation actions are not only taking place at powerful institutions, because this is the only way to create an equitable history of digital culture.
That's good. Next to the podium, Jorge Otero Pailos. Just stay a little distant.
Is it the clicking when you get too close? Is that what happens? So, how do I advance?
The big green arrow.
Perfect. Buildings have dust on their facades. You've seen those traces of dust. And we spend a lot of time as a culture washing those traces away and flushing them down the toilet. And I've spent a very long time trying to save those traces because I believe they bear a great deal of information about our civilization and about our history. And so here we have a team of preservationists who spent with me 6 years transferring the dust from this wall over here, 4 meters. So it's a long process. On June 23rd, we were rigging the dust that we had transferred using a technique that I'll show you in a second with latex in this building, which is, oh, and now I don't know how to go back.
It's the little red arrow.
Which is Westminster Hall. And what we didn't know, and we weren't thinking about because we were busy installing, was that that was the night of the Brexit vote. And of course, the next day was our opening, and people started coming in, and we were thinking, oh, how wonderful that this is, you know, so many people are showing up for our opening. But of course, they were in Westminster Hall, because Westminster Hall is the entrance to the British Parliament, and they were there to try to interview the politicians, not to interview us. It was a very heady moment because a parliamentarian had just been killed. She was a defender of the Stay campaign, and she was stabbed to death in the front of her house. And so we shared the space with a makeshift memorial to Jo Cox. Outside the walls of Westminster Hall, this is Big Ben. Westminster Hall is right next to it, were protesters who were walking down the street. They're screaming "shame on you" at 10 Downing Street, Pall Mall, ends on Parliament Square, and we were right in there. Of course, they couldn't get into Westminster Hall because, although it's a public building, you can't get in, except that we had struck this deal to give free public access to those that came to see the artwork. And so people found out that they could get these free tickets and started going in to try to get interviews with politicians. So, you know, this is Westminster Hall right here. It survived the fire of 1834 because it's a very important building because people came out to save it because it represents so many things to people. In particular, it represents that no king stands above the law. This is where Charles I was tried and put to death for trying to become an absolute monarch. But what I was interested in is these traces are not just traces of people's, you know, bodily histories, but they're really, I was interested in this environmental history. And this is 1952, the Great Smog is the first time that a peak in pollution is linked to a peak in deaths. So pollution is a factor in death. And of course, the same year was the year that King George VI died, and he lied, as all monarchs in the UK, lies in state in Westminster Hall. This is the wall that I showed you earlier that we were cleaning. There were no records of ever having cleaned it, and so we were the first ones to transfer that dust away. And what was in that dust? There was all sorts of things in that dust. This is the attempt to try to kill the beetles that were in the hammerbeam oak roof that are called the Death Watch beetles because they're eating away at this very famous 14th century 13th century roof, and they lie above the monarchs and kind of look down on the monarchs, and so they're called the Death Watch beetle. And they're trying to fumigate them. It didn't quite work. But when Elizabeth II passed away last year, this is the wall. And the wall was, of course, cleaned because we spent all that time trying to move away that dust. These are boxes that are made out of foam and plywood and are painted to look like the wall, but they're not actually the wall. So there are traces in this building. Every building is a trace of history. These are traces of great monarchs and big, you know, individuals. They tell a story of humanity that is top down, and we were trying to save a story of humanity that is really a composite of these traces. But of course, these traces pick up meaning as we move along, and they're not just the physical materiality of the trace that is important, but it's also what it means to us to look and contemplate these traces. And of course, you know, what happened is that this project picked up a lot of meaning along the way, and a lot of museums were interested in the piece. So we ended up deciding to cut it into pieces and sending a piece to each of the national museums of the UK, a piece to Northern Ireland, to Scotland, to Wales. And so here you have a piece in the museum. Now, of course, this for me is very important in light of what we're talking about today in terms of what is the role of archives, what is the role of museums. Nobody wants to archive pollution. We don't have a kind of world pollution archive. But actually, museums are great places to archive artworks. And so, you know, I've been turning my archive of pollution into artworks and thinking of them as distributed monuments. And so they're distributed around in museums where these traces of pollution from around the world are kept, and someday they might actually come together in some form. And so just to give you a sense of how the process of collecting the trace is done, I use a latex poultice to then apply to the wall, and then as that latex dry, it absorbs all the dust on the surface of the wall, and as it evaporates, it sucks the dust literally off of the wall. And so as it does that, then it dries, and then you can pull it off the wall as a kind of skin. And so for me, it was very important to then take this pollution and then show it in the museum and have it archived in the museum as a trace, because here is the cast courts of the Victoria and Albert Museum, where if you didn't have the money to do the grand tour, you would go in and see all the fragments, all the traces of European high culture. So what does it mean to put a trace of pollution in that very space, and to think about putting together the pieces of our civilization, incorporating the pollution that we make? Because, of course, if we didn't make pollution, if we didn't burn fossil fuels, we wouldn't have the civilization that we have. So what does it mean to begin to think of that pollution and those traces as a cultural artifact with meaning, and not just as a material that has only value insofar as we can tell its material composition, but what is his symbolic composition as well. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you.
And
Next, we have a video by Stefan Elmreich.
Waves in the open ocean, scientists say, are patterns of energy moving through water, not water itself hurtling bodily forward. Waves are traces, tracings made by the force of storms, of wind, sometimes of ships. Waves, scrolling out in sets, are a kind of ordered writing on the tracing paper that is the ocean surface. What tales do such tracings tell? Tales of tempests, spooling out swells like those tracked in the 1960s by oceanographers tracing wave trains moving from Antarctic seas to Alaskan bays, packets of energy transmitted from the southern to the northern hemisphere. Waves here as traces made legible through scientific description, relayed across a trans-Pacific network of observing islands made available to scientists by 20th century US-American hydrocolonial reach. Tales of traveling surfers, launching from the invention in Hawaii of wave sliding or he'inalu, a tradition whose traces later diffract into conversation and contest with Californian, Australian, and other industries of sun, fun, and coastal leisure. Tales of what Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp calls the transverse waves of the wake of transatlantic slave ships, waves of a haunting past not fully past that traces into the present, including into the deadly seas of today's migrant Mediterranean, scarred by the wakes of boats capsized and criminally neglected. Tales, no surprise, of sea level rise and of the intensifying storms of climate change, which is leading to increased wave heights in many parts of the globe. Waves in the ocean, scientists say, are patterns. Patterns that may be read, we can now add, for traces of histories, presents, and futures.
Would like now to call Sarah Johnson.
Thank you. All right, so this third dot here, this one's us. This is an image that was taken from nearly 900 million miles away of our world. And as an astrobiologist and planetary scientist, I've spent a lot of my life trying to learn how to look for life on these other worlds that appear just like this, as just these mere points of light in the night. And part of that has also involved just trying to learn to look better by going to places around our world that have relevant similarities to other planetary environments, like the Atacama Desert and the Australian outback, some basaltic lava tubes. And this is one of my lab's field sites. This is the dry valleys in Antarctica. And this is a place that for the longest time was thought to be totally devoid of life. It was first discovered by Robert Falcon Scott back during the heroic age of exploration as he was attempting the pole and tragically lost his life. He left some companions behind to do the first geological surveys of what they called the Dry Valley. Turns out there were a lot of valleys. They called it the Valley of Death. They said that this was just a harrowing, lifeless place, just as desolate as you could possibly imagine. And this was a place that, even until the 1960s, there was a paper in Science magazine that talked about how it was sterile because scientists had brought pieces of the dry valleys back, these soils, and tried to grow them in petri dishes, and nothing grew. And a few years later, it was discovered that some microbes, some invisible organisms, did dwell in this place. But it really wasn't until the advent of genomic methods where we didn't require something to grow to detect that it existed, where we could read out the DNA of every organism, that we realized that we had just been missing so much. I mean, maybe 99% of the types of life that actually thrive in this environment we had just completely missed. And so, when we start thinking about other worlds, we can use a lot of the same sorts of techniques to look for life. We can look for things like DNA, like molecular fossils, like particular patterns among classes of lipids and other molecules. We can look for textures, for biomolecules, for isotopic fractions, for minerals. I've spent a lot of my time thinking about Mars, the next planet over, and Mars is just as similar as the Earth, as any place we've ever found, looking out. Really similar histories, especially around the time life was getting started here. Life also, there are tons of rocks being thrown around, so we could have just kind of caught life from the next planet over as well. And so it makes sense to sort of look at Mars and use those same techniques that we use here on Earth to understand traces of life. And Mars is a place that seems so familiar, right? This looks like the Arizona desert or like Jordan, these places that we've seen. It's a place you could fall and scrape your knee, and we think that we know it, right? But there are so many things that are so baffling about this planet, like the fact that the sunsets are blue on Mars. These images were taken by the Opportunity rover in 2011, and even when you understand the optical physics, it just seems so baffling that there are these incandescent sunsets. And we've been bowled over time and again by just how indescribably foreign these places are, that we think that we should know and could know intimately. And things start to get even stranger as we move further away from Earth. This is Europa, a moon of Jupiter. It looks like a bloodshot eyeball. Underneath this thick layer of ice, there's a global ocean that we think has existed since the beginning of the Jovian system, a liquid water ocean created by tidal heating. This is far from what a lot of astronomers consider the habitable zone. A little bit further out, this is Enceladus, this tiny moon of Saturn. It's about the size of England, also just covered with this beautiful white snow. They're cryovolcanoes that are delivering brine from, again, a global under ice ocean out into space. And then this place, too, Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, the only moon that we know of that has a thick atmosphere. This is a place with clouds and weather and pale hills and dark rivers, and there are lakes of ethane and methane. It is a world where there's liquid, but it's not water at all. It's a gasoline world. And you start thinking about what could the building blocks of life be on a place with such very different chemistry, which sort of leads to one of the big things I've been working on in my research is this project called the Laboratory for Agnostic Biosignatures, which NASA has funded us to run to really grapple with this question of how do we contend with the truly alien, one of the most deep challenges that we face, and really how do we search for indicators of life without presupposing an underlying biochemistry, a specific kind of particular molecular framework. And so you might say, that's really hard. That's kind of like imagining some color you've never seen before. How do you do that? How do you look for life as you don't know it? And it turns out there are lots of ways. I thought I'd just show you this kind of one example. as a colleague of mine on our team named Lee Cronin likes to say, if you found a 747 out on the surface of Mars, you might have no idea where it came from, but it probably wasn't random, especially if you found a whole fleet of 747s. And so we've been trying to do the molecular equivalent of that, looking for chemical complexity. If we could find molecules and break them into their simplest pieces and then look at how the pathways that are required to put that molecule together. And if the shortest pathway is sufficiently long, if that molecule is complex enough, then we're using algorithms to suggest that there's a threshold above which only biology can make those types of molecules. And so if we find molecules like ATP in another planetary environment, even if they might not even be carbon-based, they could be totally different, but with that kind of complexity, we are working on those ideas using other methods to go after surface complexity, fingerprinting those patterns, looking at the way elements and isotopes can accumulate into compartments that are separate from the environment, looking for signs of chemical disequilibrium. We're also looking for signs of energy transfer. There's this wonderful Nobel Prize-winning physiologist who once said, life is nothing but an electron looking for a place to rest. And I think I have to finish. And I think that was my last slide. So I will leave it there, but happy to discuss more during the Q&A.
Thank you for this great presentation. Next is a video by Susan Schupley.
In 1955, the U.S. Army began a clandestine program to store nuclear missiles deep beneath the Greenland ice sheet, creating a 3-kilometer network of tunnels powered by a nuclear reactor. They called it Project Iceworm. While the engineers were tunneling, a small team of scientists began drilling deep down into the ice, hauling slender columns of ice to the surface in meter-long sections. This was the beginning of deep ice core science. Today, cores are studied forensically for the ancient records they contain: air from millennia ago sealed in ice, volcanic ash deposited onto the ice sheets. But increasingly, it is the story of human passage that is etched into frozen matter. Eruptions, emissions, pollutants, now plastics. Ice archives it all. Earth evidence. July 16th, 1945, the moment at which we altered the planet's baseline levels of radiation. 18 years later, when a treaty threatened to end all atmospheric and underwater nuclear testing, a final unleashing of atomic blasts, an expunging of national stockpiles. Radioactive ice from 1963 can still be found throughout the cryosphere. I call this hot ice. By 1967, Project Iceworm was terminated when engineers realized that ice is not as stable as they had once imagined. Left behind were biological and chemical pollutants, as well as an unknown quantity of radioactive waste, buried forever under annual layers of snowfall, or so they thought. At current rates of warming, these burial chambers will be breached not by tomb raiders in the conventional sense, but by melting, and the toxic remains of this Cold War experiment will surface. In a remote corner of Siberia, a mysterious anthrax outbreak occurred in 2016, killing one young boy and infecting dozens of others. The emergence of this pathogen was linked to soaring temperatures that thawed the permafrost. A reindeer carcass infected with anthrax some 75 years ago had been brought back up to the surface, reactivating its frozen spores. "It's a Pandora's box," said one of the field scientists. "They don't know what lies buried there." Traces of past events now returning, material witnesses reanimated, ice melting.
And now I'd like to call to the podium Susan Meiselas.
Yeah, transitions. I don't know about anybody else, but I don't know if I'm on the moon or back to the ground or under the ground. I mean, I wanted to share work from Nicaragua and El Salvador from 40 years ago, and I'm still haunted by images that are hard for me to talk about. So just to begin and picking up, there are so many themes here, but I'm beginning as an outsider. I'm beginning as someone not necessarily looking for something specific, but I'm responding to, I'm reading signs, visual signs. I'm trying to make a picture that's perceiving a present, anticipating, imagining in the future how those images will be seen as past. So the question always is, what can we see? And we've been discussing that. So the surface is visible, but what lies beneath? And so this image, obviously, layers of paint. There's a trace in the writing. There's a trace in the erasure. The writing denounces a disappearance. In black, it reads, "Where is Norma Gonzalez? The dictatorship must answer." In red, scratched into the white paint, covering what cannot be read, is Monimbo will never surrender. Another trace, the Mano Blanca, a threat on the door of a peasant leader. A week later, it marks his murder. The symbol of the death squads, a clandestine force in El Salvador at that time. It represents not only this man's fate, but a repressive regime, a trace of the risk taken and the consequence suffered. Sometimes the trace is of a place. It's seen only upon entering. No bodies, just papers strewn. Blood remains the evidence of an attack, an affirmation of rumors finally rendered. These are all pictures of the aftermath of violence. My first encounter with someone who had been disappeared was a body on a hillside outside the capital of Managua, Nicaragua, in 1978, a well-known site of execution. But what did someone think he thought or might do? What remains as a trace is a testimony, a presence of his absence. While traveling down a main highway, I'm stopped and forced to witness. I abstract a scene to protect the necessity to make a record. A pragmatic choice of this frame triggers the question, can it be understood by those who have not watched an interrogation of others? For those who are like me, seeing the horror, and for those who chose not to look, what is the trace of exposure to an encounter? It may take time or never be fully acknowledged, understood, or even remembered. Perhaps it will be unconsciously registered, but never consciously processed. Here on Interstate 5 in California, a decade later, undocumented workers from Central America are caught crossing the US-Mexico border. They hope to move across time and space, seeking economic or political exile. But what is imprinted and etched into their memory? With crossings, I take frames from my archive, interweaving fragments pulled from the history of their making, to create another framework, a context to revisit and follow those who are carrying their past forward. I see these photographs as documents of a process that is continuous and changing, much like the lives of the people within them. We see them, but we don't think about what they have seen. Bringing images back from the past into the landscape of the present, to Nicaragua 25 years after they were first made. It is especially for those under 25 who have only listened to stories but not lived this history.
Eso era lo que se daba en esa época. Bajar a toda la gente de un búho, hacer un registro buscando armas, guerrilleros decían ellos, y al que ellos miraban sospechoso y creían conveniente, lo dejaban y lo aniquilaban. Entonces no sé pues si se trataba de otra imagen, pero al inmediato esa es la imagen, como eso es lo que tengo fijado en mi mente en esa época.
There is the life of a photograph and the lives framed within it, but hoping to move beyond it. The ask is, what can the photographic trace bring back and activate in the future? Thanks.
Well, thank you all for these amazing presentations. I would like to invite you to come and sit. You pick the chair that you want. That is mine. I'm at the end. But otherwise, you're free. But I'm in awe of everything that you do and the presentations that you have made for us today. And one thing you all have in common, even though you're all, besides the fact that you look for traces, is also the pride that you take not only in the outcome of your research, but also in the method. And that is quite important because we always have an agenda, Christina and I, for the salons, and the agenda that we had tonight is the need to make people excited about investigation, about tracing, and about really being, really making it happen. So I would like to know how do you connect with your public, if you do, and whether you explain the method or you want them just to take what they see, not at face value, but just accept it and move from there. You're nodding a lot, Jorge. Do you want to talk about it?
I can certainly start. Yeah. I mean, I think for me the works have to communicate at various levels, and so I don't typically explain the method. I often just exhibit them as they are. But I think in today's world, the work also exists in so many other ways, and the internet, and so anybody that really wants to dig in can do so easily that the practice can be researched, and with the strike you can just Google it really quickly. So I like the experience in person to be one where there is a kind of immediacy and a confrontation with the materiality of the actual thing, and with the scale of it, and I think in that way people might actually register the idea that all around us are these buildings that have environmental traces, and that buildings are environmental sensors, and that they register long periods of time. And all you have to do is look, but we are erasing those traces. So I think that was something that I saw in a lot of everybody else's work, is the fragility and vulnerability of these traces. There's very little 19th century pollution left in New York City, because we've cleaned it all off. So it's actually really hard to find out what was actually in the air in the 1880s in New York, because, we don't really have very good records. People were taking notes in a notebook, but we actually have the physical stuff. So that's for me really important, to see to encounter the actual thing, and not necessarily to be drawn into the method too quickly, because then it becomes a different kind of process for the viewer, I think.
And I would say, Crystal, probably it's the same for you. As an artist, you don't want people to dig too deep into the methodology at first, but rather, what kind of what methods that you are developing, what types of traces have you uncovered in your work that have previously been ignored by history or by traditional modes of archiving?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so through your work, what kind of traces have you uncovered that had been ignored before, either missed or ignored by traditional methods of archiving?
Yeah, well, I think that, archiving, of course, is a very, as I mentioned, a very colonial form of recording. And I think that I have so much in common with maybe the way that you were working with the ethics of dust in one particular project that I mentioned called Guerrilla Means War with the found film, because there was a moment, just thinking about what it means to archive, a piece of work, a piece of cultural production, of Black cultural production that is not protected, that is not preserved in any other way. And I was trying to get this film transferred, digitized, so that I could edit it. And I remember ending up having to scan 20,000 films of the frame manually because the film was stuck together because of the long period of neglect. And so I was pulling this film apart, and sometimes it would tear or rip. And essentially, I was able to pull it all apart and have it digitally scanned. And I remember the archivist calling me and saying, "Oh, I could clean this off for you." And I was like, "No, don't clean it off, because there are fingerprints and there's dust and there's rat feces and, all of this sort of evidence of that systemic racism is embedded in this object and is a reflection of that sort of environment." So I wanted to preserve that in the film.
That's clear. So that is what you have uncovered and what you want to uncover in the future. And I just want to follow up for a moment, because I remember when the book, Crystal, it's still with you for a second. Because, when the book about Henrietta Lacks came out several years ago, it really struck me, because the traces of Henrietta Lacks cancer are all over the world. And recently there was a series of news with the family being actually recognized as having rights to the cells. If you look online, the HeLa, Henrietta Lacks, HeLa cells are, a big market. So the Henrietta Lacks story in particular really begged for an artist's intervention. So I would like to know what you have achieved with the artwork, how was it accepted, and if it pushed the whole plight of the HeLa cells further.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that what's been interesting to me is I made that work in 2012, I believe. And for a lot of people, sometimes through artwork is the first time they encounter the narrative. And I think it's really interesting. It also tells us so much about the role of education in perpetuating very particular narratives and not others. And so that archive of history, I'm always thinking about how can we sort of rupture that canon, or how can I sort of Trojan horse something into an artwork so that people can access it, people that maybe don't have access to a lot of other ways of finding out this information, can access it through an artwork. And what does that mean to sort of access it in these deliberate fragments?
Thank you. And now for Christian. So your team, you didn't have one, no problem. Your team relies on open source methods, right? So, which is to say that it's all information that is accessible to the general public. So do you hope that the work you do might help people to be more attuned to the latent information around them, to start reading the traces themselves? Once again, I go back to the method just to see if I can push my agenda.
No, I mean, 100%, right? Because we use a lot of openly available information that's accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And the interesting thing is, I work now for the New York Times and I have brilliant colleagues, right? All the work that I present is always with a team. And I wouldn't have worked for the New York Times if it wasn't for me looking on Twitter to see, okay, I'm from the Netherlands. The Netherlands used to play a very big part in, Wow, it's each time I touch the microphone, there's like things going. Okay,
No,
okay.
it's not you, it's me. It's not you, it's me.
I could have never dreamed of ending up working for the New York Times, but it was because of openly available information. A weapon fragment that I showed, for example, that I was like, hey, I can use this to actually see, is my country responsible, for example, for the death of a civilian in Iraq? Because the military won't report on it. And I think what is the really great thing too about using openly available information, that I can say, well, you don't need to believe me, you don't need to trust me just because I work for the New York Times or I give a either chaotic or a great talk. It's just like you can, the great thing is like, you don't need to believe me that those 4 bolts are from that American weapon. If you find any other weapon in the world that you say, okay, this is actually a Russian-made bomb, great, I'll believe it too, because then I can do that investigation. But if I cannot find anything else, I can go to the Pentagon or I can go to the Israeli Ministry or I can go to a police department and say, hey, I think you are responsible for this. What is your answer? Because you're denying any involvement. And I think that's the great thing. People can look at that visual themselves and go find a reference image of that bomb and say, yeah, actually, it's like finding the difference. And it's like, yeah, actually, they are the same type of bomb. So I think that's a very strong way of presenting our work.
And Susan, you wrote a book in 1974 that was called Learn to See. Yeah, I know, I go back a little bit, but that's important. We go back in your life a bit, but it's still very valid. So whose responsibility is it to train a general audience, and how do we train a general audience to read traces within works, and especially thinking about photography?
It's so wild you're asking me that question.
Yeah.
Well, we used to have this idea of visual literacy, and it was teachable. I was really trying to, at the time in the South Bronx, train kids to leave a classroom and encounter the world. So it started with being in the world. I mean, I'm sort of overwhelmed here because I keep looking at Sarah thinking, I mean, essentially you found the obsessive gene in each one of us. and I can't even imagine how she was educated to be the person she is, truthfully. I mean, the basic teaching at that time was the encounter. And it's funny, I talked about encounters I never expected to have. But I was encouraging, even with a shoebox and a pinhole camera, to be in the world at that time. So it's not just about what you see, it's about your relationship to the making of, the seeing, the observing, the discovering, the investigating, all of this process that I was encouraging. And it just happened to be the medium was the message, as they said.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, talking about learning to see. So is it so difficult for humans to imagine beyond their own reality, to, because in popular media, aliens are always imagined as humanoid creatures. So it's very hard to go beyond. So is there a way to learn to see beyond?
Yes, I guess. I guess we could start by not making all of our aliens look like us. Actually, it's been fun. I've been watching some of the old Star Trek.
I was about to ask you, what are your favorite sci-fis?
Yeah, well, with my children, and it's just been really interesting to sort of go back and look at the creativity that has come through science fiction and, so much of even the space age before we even had the rockets that could get us beyond Earth. We had people imagining them in comic books and in these pulp novels, all kinds of things. But I guess you have to sort of be able to push things forward. And I think about those authors, those people that were just coming up with all kinds of ideas, and they were being represented in ways that got so many people excited about science as children, who went on to become people, actually looking for the exact same things that were depicted in those early shows and in those comic books.
But when you're looking for the truly alien, how did you call it in your beautiful agnostic And what is the name of your company, of your group?
Oh, we call it it's an acronym within an acronym, which probably isn't the best, but it's the Laboratory for Agnostic Biosignatures.
Yes.
Lab.
Lab.
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't know. We might have some regrets about that. But
No, it's beautiful. But so how do you make people unsee the humanoid alien and instead be open to maybe not even see, because says who that they are visible, right?
Well, I do think it's really important to just think about the limits of analogy. And I think for me, even just like looking at the history of Mars exploration, there have been so many blind alleys, so many twists and turns, so many times where it would seem like this just mirror of ourselves. And especially when there's a sort of emptiness, we project onto it. And I think time and again, we project ourselves. And, when it comes to figuring out sort of what to look for or how to look, we're on this spectrum. We have to be so careful about the limits of analogy, not just, when we look out to the world, but also just like where we are, even in understanding biology. I mentioned in my talk how these, so much of the life that exists all around us, we didn't even realize was there. And when the first Viking experiments, this was the first landed mission on Mars in the 1970s, were designed, there was an experiment. It was called the chicken soup experiment, built by this guy named Vance Oyama. And it was the whole premise of it was that you can put microbes in this nutrient-rich broth and they'll grow. They'll just be so happy. They'll grow and grow and grow. And you'll see all this evidence of metabolism. But we just, we're on this spectrum of understanding where we didn't understand that even just about the biology in our own world, that was not a metric of growth, that 99% of our organisms wouldn't actually grow in a petri dish in a little laboratory in those conditions. And if we designed those experiments now, we would have designed them differently. So I think just being aware of our own sort of hubris, too, of where we are just kind of toddlers when it comes to all of this in many ways.
Well, I'm going to now get to the moment. Okay, yeah, you're there, ready. Okay, there's a microphone here, the moment you were all waiting for. The questions from the audience. Can I have a mic? Or, well, I'm going to steal yours. Oh, it's coming. Thank you. I couldn't see. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
And maybe introduce yourself briefly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alphonse. I'm a Master of Environmental Design student at the Yale School of Architecture, and also a writer and curator, and hopefully here as a beneficiary of Paula's infinite generosity. And thank you so much for convening this, and thank you all for such wonderful presentations. I have two questions, actually.
I'll give you one.
Okay, I will merge them. I will merge them very quickly. First. The only question I have is, I'm really curious about the role of death and loss to the traces after you have traced the traces, because the traces exist as documentations of some sort. You are making a mark, you are learning a memory. But what happens after you learn it? When do you decide when to let go? When do you decide to let something die? And have learning about traces all this while affected in a way the way your dreams and think?
Yeah,
have the traces
that's
infiltrated
a question
you?
I also had, so thank you for asking it. Yeah, so
Great
Susan.
minds think alike.
Susan.
I'm not sure I can touch that. Because it lives, I tried to suggest, it lives in the unknown spaces and places within. It's very hard for me to find words. There's a big struggle to try and even share something that's so long ago and yet it's so present. That's a very complicated piece of this process too. So the traces within that of whatever I've seen or attempted to document, or going back to this question of process, what you hope a public can not consume but feel connected to, right? That in itself is still such a mysterious process for me. So I know it was a lot to ask any of you to look at a photograph as long as you did of that body. I wasn't looking for the body, right? The vultures circling above it are what told me that there was something happening below. And so I relate a lot to how it's open source. It's a different kind of open source, a processing. But how do I live with what I saw, or what I ask other people to live with, seeing the image I made? I made two, one on a black and white contact sheet, which is skewed, and one color frame. And I mostly was afraid that someone would see me making the picture and so, you're implicated by what you document as well as what you investigate, as you pointed to. Mm-hmm. So it's a brilliant question, and I don't know that I can really go much further. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to respond to this question? Mm-mm. No? Mm-hmm. It's an important one, because the question that Christina had formulated was about the traces that are left on the photographer, on the subject, on the viewers. And before you all came, Susan was fine-tuning the projector. It was too dark, so we couldn't really see people in the background in the picture with the body that is upside down. And so there was a sense of the photographer seeing all the people that were seeing, that were also watching. So there is a relationship that is complex and very important, that is about ultimately maybe not forgetting, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would just add one footnote that when I made that photograph, it took me a very long time to come back to that very place where I made the photograph. There was a whole sequence of what happened that led to seeing that body at that moment. And I was fixated on exactly what Paolo's referring to, that those faces in the back looking away. And I was trying to find those people about 10 years ago. So it was some time after I'd made the photograph. And I couldn't trace those who were living with the trace. And that's really ultimately what I was hoping to do. But moving around that place with a photograph, which is something that you would assume someone would recognize someone or remember that moment, I was really surprised. I haven't made the work about that search, but that tells you something, it's still living. It's frozen, it's fixed, it's a frame, it's framed on a wall, and yet it's still, unresolved, unanswered.
Thank you. By the way, you have priority if you want to ask questions to each other. I'll give you priority, just in case. Okay, there's over there with the mask. Yeah, thank you. I don't recognize you.
Thanks very much. I'm Anna Scapellas, Professor of Sociology at CUNY here in New York. So some of the comments pointed at the lack of trust in science and institutions. So Christian was talking about what should be grounds for believing in specific arguments, why we should believe specific organizations, why the public should believe us. And Crystal was talking about creating evidence where archives are missing, and also about the colonial kind of heritages of archiving as an institution. So my question to all of you is, how do you relate to and collaborate with institutions of scientific and political authority in your own work? And also, how would you like to see these institutions reformed, especially as you work? Doesn't necessarily attack it, but doesn't always work in ways that affirm the maybe conservative character of some of these institutions. Thank you.
Who wants to start with that? Crystal, go for it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. Thank you for the question. I've been thinking a lot about sort of this compulsion to preserve everything, to conserve everything, and sort of where those hierarchies are. And I think specifically in my practice, the things that I really want to bring attention to are histories that are not as popularly known, people that are not as popularly known, that I feel like I want people to pay attention to, that I feel like are important. And, maybe that's a very selfish thing. And I think ultimately a lot of the sort of saving and collecting and preserving is very selfish in a way. And I think also very, I also wonder, I think a lot about sort of this preserving and collecting and saving. It's a type of hoarding, right? And it's a type of, perhaps it is a sort of sociological illness in a way, right? That we need to sort of save everything. I was reading something today about the intro to this book on dust, and it was talking about sort of the perversity of saving everything. So maybe I'll leave that. Not yours, not yours.
Jorge, respond to that. The obsession and the impulse.
Am I
to
the
preserve. Well, no, I mean you're preserving pollution. It's interesting. It's exciting.
Well, I mean there's a lot of things that don't get preserved that need to be preserved, and I think that we have set up when we decided that we needed to preserve artworks, we set up institutions like MoMA and museums, national collections, and so on. When we decided that we collectively decided, so it's small p politics. How do we make
collectively might be argued. That's also one of the questions that was.
There's a collective. So we decided we wanted to preserve cities or historic neighborhoods, then we created landmarks commissions. We decided we wanted to preserve World Heritage. We created this World Heritage Commission at the UN, which doesn't have any power. The municipal government has power. It doesn't have any power to actually implement things. So we now, I think, have a very different situation in a climate crisis and the need to rethink the kinds of things that we preserve, but we don't have the institutions. So I think for me, what was interesting in a lot of the work is, thinking through when there is no institution, but you see and you sense that something needs to be saved, or the institutions are trying to actively hide the evidence. What can you do? There's an activism in that, and there is a madness in it, of course, because you're rowing up against the river, because everything else is trying to push all that away and flush it away. So I think it's okay to be a little bit obsessive, because otherwise you never find the energy to go upstream. It goes to the question earlier about institutions and so on, but I think I see that in a lot of the work here.
I'm thinking that also Anna's question was more about how do you correct a certain pre-established kind of framework that is the one that comes from the colonial era. And just very quickly, what Crystal was talking about reminds me of the moment that folders were introduced in the computer systems and people were trying to put everything in the right folder. And at some point, I remember who it was that said, no, stop it. Just put all the documents together. You'll remember where to find things because you remember the traces. So it was very radical for me at that time, but in a way, it's about learning to retrace yourself every single time without trusting somebody else to set up the archive for you. I'm not saying that one position is right and the other is wrong. I find it really fascinating, the two polar.
Paula, that just triggers a different memory.
Yeah.
I thought the smart thing, it's kind of pre-AI, was that the computer would remember everything.
Yeah.
And all you had to do, it would order it according to alphabet or according to keywords. Yeah, but what I meant is that it freed me from feeling that I had to create the order, because it had multiple systems of order far beyond me.
That's it. There's a hand over there. I can't see who it belongs to, but there, it's a big hand, and it's.
Thank you, Paula. I'm Alan McFarland. I am the Associate Dean of Students at NYU. I'm also an adjunct professor in Africana Studies. Ralph Ellison once wrote that craft is an aspect of morality, and I hear a moral compass in all of your work. But my question is, with all the obsession of collecting so many things, and I think about my own life in terms of what would be important to me in leaving traces. I want to get a little deeper with you all now. What would you put in your own museum?
Oh, I
What
thought you were about to
artifact?
say time capsule.
What artifact?
Museum is like
Yeah.
interesting.
What
yeah.
artifact would you put in on a personal level, not your work, but on a more personal level, and why?
What's the museum?
Well,
Which museum are
can
we?
I switch it to time capsule so there's less of this kind of like established, institutional memory? Like, yeah, if you were to leave a trace.
I have a.
Yeah.
I actually like the museum one.
Oh, okay, there you go. I'm the one that's had enough. Yeah.
The only thing I think what I really, really liked is the hand movement of her dad on her face.
I was thinking about it. Yeah.
And I think something like that is such a beautiful thought of not having it like some physical thing or, I don't know, this is like a hair of Einstein or that kind of stuff, but like just like something, a gesture or something from us as human beings that is so hard to capture that we maybe cannot even imagine, but when it's there, you can feel it. And maybe that I really like that. So
it was beautiful, huh? I think that's also one of the reasons, in my opinion, of the renaissance of performance, because the embodiment of traces of memories, etc., is something that we crave almost in this day and age. So who else? We have somebody here. Oh, you wanted to say? Oh, you have a sorry. They have priority. So you ask Sarah the question, and then I'm going to come to you.
I've been fascinated actually by the space missions to Mars and the amount of effort that we put into that. And there is a whole kind of body of work of biosignature preservation, right? Of how, and you mentioned this today. And I just don't know the answer to this, and maybe you do, but since we're talking about traces, why does NASA and the scientific community call it biosignature rather than biotrace?
Huh.
I don't know. It's just...
Gosh, I'm not sure if I can speak for NASA and the whole community. And actually, I'm not entirely sure I do know the origin of the word, but there has been, like the idea of changing that word. Like sometimes people say we should say bio hint, because like a biosignature, that sounds so definitive, and we need to, be thinking about kind of, again, this spectrum of certainty that we may be seeing, and we really need so many lines of evidence. Like Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, things along those lines. But it would be interesting to go back in the linguistics and see where it came from.
Or it's about another humanoid thing, like it all has to look like humans, human sign, therefore. It could be. Good question, though.
Can I go back to just the man who asked that question with a strange, different angle on it? I have a very dear friend living in London who's diminishing in a number of ways of her capability, and she has a space in her home which has accumulated an enormous amount of previous work. And I said to her daughter, while she's here, we should really try and unpack. And she's not a hoarder, she just has done a lot. And while she's here and she can remember and she can maybe help us order, etc. And her daughter is my goddaughter, and she responded by saying, does everyone have to leave a record?
Huh.
And I that was very painful to me, actually. Because if there's anyone that you would hope would care, it would be the daughter, to care that there's some record. What is the record? And it kind of goes back to some of what you touched on, right? What does it mean not to have a record of whatever we all think we've done or lived or been or whatever? It was a very strong and surprising response.
One of the presumptions of so many of the people that we quoted is that there is a record, whether you leave it or not, right? And so maybe it's about not pre-establishing the order, or, well, many people do. Many people just build their own legacy, design it, they want it packaged, control it. But even if they didn't do that, there would be, hypothetically, a way to retrace them.
But the trace may be in what we remember of that person and not something physical left behind, which is what I guess she was suggesting. But I, having lived through watching people come in when somebody dies and erasing literally everything that's there and fragmenting it into various pots, and it ends up in a flea market or whatever, that's a very brutal act if you don't take the responsibility to think through what might be special there.
Very strong. Yeah. Did you want to say something, Sarah? I saw that you were...
Oh, well, I think it's just been sort of interesting because I think I've spent so much time thinking on these just enormous scales, like thinking about geologic time, and it's like everything collapses. Everything collapses into these layers in a human life. Like, what is that? That's just this briefest of moments. And I was thinking about the question that that was just posed about what we leave, and it's, I don't know. My answer for that has sort of been, I had a friend who suggested a few years ago when my kids were making all kinds of pictures that, we couldn't keep all the pictures and they were sweet, but just to take an iPhone picture and set up a little email address and send it along. And it started off just sort of as that. And then they would say things and I would like sort of write them down and send it off to this like email address of the future that my children would someday share. And over the last few years, it's morphed into like this very kind of obsessive, like I just write them these letters, like sometimes in the middle of the night that just go on and on and on. And I feel like it's this strange conversation that I'm like having with some future version of somebody I care incredibly deeply about. And it's like sort of out there in the cloud somewhere that they will like someday be like a repository of. But it's almost like, I feel like that is the one thing that I'll leave when everything else decays and just collapses. Like there's just this kind of conversation that I started before they could have it with me that I feel like will be my thing.
I love that sort of those letters to the future. I was just thinking about sort of the digital divide and machine learning and sort of like how AI is sort of making a sort of synthesis or collective archive, based on a lot of the material that we're feeding it, right? But also it's sort of exacerbating the digital divide in that way because for folks that are not tapped in, they're further left out of that record, aren't they?
Well, the inequality is a self-fulfilling prophecy and it's systemic, and the more the world advances, the more it deepens. So I agree. But there was, over here, third row, please. Yes. Wait, for the mic, so everybody hears you. Thank you.
Thanks. I think Sarah sort of answered the question that I was coming to. I'm personally much more fascinated by the future than the past, in a lot of ways.
Can you introduce yourself? Do you mind?
My name is Ravi Surya. I am a venture capitalist. So, previously an engineer in a prior life, but much more fascinated by the future. And I was thinking, what is... When you talk about traces, it's temporally backwards. We are thinking about everything in the past. So on a time scale, everything that you do, whether from a scientific, an archival, or an artistic perspective, is T minus backwards. What would you think is the equivalent of it looking forward? We talk about time travel, other things. What would be, the mirror image, if you may, of traces? What is there a word that exists, or an idea, a concept, a scientific construct, an artistic expression? Anyway, just turn the mirror the other way, and if you're walking through that door instead of backward, what would it be? Any thoughts on that?
Jorge, you seem to have...
I thought that was for you, actually.
Okay. No, you like it. You know, the past, the future, same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Same
that, you know,
difference.
you're right, that they're mirrors, you know, of each other, and they're both unknowns. I mean, that the past is just as complicated to get to know as the future, and we have as very little evidence of the past, really, as we do of the future. So they are, in a way, asking us to really put pieces together to make sense of our own temporality. So, you know, we might be here, and we might think of, okay, what happened yesterday and what's happening tomorrow as you know, back you know, the past and the future. But, you know, really, is Monday the past and you know, what day is today? Like, so,
Tuesday.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm very interested in the future as well. That's why I look at the past, because we now know more about the future than we ever did before, because of how we're thinking, you know, of all those traces of pollution, really determining the way that the climate is going to behave in the future. So that's something new. Like, we didn't really, I mean, I think historically, as a humanity, didn't really have this sense of this kind of cyclops, you know, view of the future. We know a lot more about the future, and so that is both exhilarating and somehow very scary to everyone, because what it means is this you know, having to actually adapt to the uncertainty that the more certain the future is, the more uncertain also the reality that we live in becomes, because we know that we're going to have to change. But I think that the past is a kind of landmark, because we make collective decisions about what we want in the future, because we know that the future is not going to have everything that we have, you know, here today. Like, all the clothes that all of us are wearing today are not going to be around.
All the water
yeah.
that we have today.
So,
by the way, if in the next few days you have time to peruse the bibliography, the references that Christina put together, the essay by Routledge on archaeology and traces is really great as to the relationship between past and future and traces and understanding. It's fascinating. So,
but I maybe give the mic to others here to think about. I like to think of the future anterior. You know, the kind of, if I project myself into the future and look back, you know, that temporality where's a kind of the counterfactuals of what ifs really start to create different kinds of paths, different kinds of possibilities for the future. Because I think that when we think of the future, we tend to be very path determined. We try to narrow down the possibilities in order to, you know, make investments or make decisions. It's very human, but we know that historically there's disruption that happens, and so I'm very interested in the future anterior. And within the future anterior, there are objects like those that we confine to museums, or that help us start to plot the future, because we know they're going to be there.
So unless there's somebody that itches to answer the question again, since we don't have much time left, I wanted to also give other opportunities. So there's one question here and one there. So let's start with this, and maybe I also have to look at the back. Yeah, here. Oh. Second row. Do we have a microphone?
I have a microphone here, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, you had already? Okay, I shouldn't. Yeah, you decide who takes the questions. Yeah, thank you. It's better. Yes. So this question, and then you decide. Mm-hmm.
So my name is Fotini Markopoulou, and I'm a theoretical physicist. And so we saw a lot of traces. We're shown a lot of traces. But we also had to be told stories about what those traces are and what it is that we are looking at. If we just had the traces, we wouldn't know. And so I'm really interested, and I want to ask you about these two sides to what it is that we have seen. One is the obsessive systematic work. I think the obsessive gene is a great line here, because it has to exist. And the other is, look, guys, this is what has attracted my attention. I've been looking at it for so long. It's now starting to telling me things. I want to share that. And there is there is a lot in this tension that also happens in physics. I'm making a theory, I can spend years doing it, but why did I care about that question in the first place?
Okay.
So
I'm going to stop you just
that
because we have so many.
is objective and a part that is personal. And I wanted to ask you, how do you play with these things?
Who wants to answer? Christian? Yeah. Now, your microphone back. Thank you.
I can answer it. It's a good question. Thank you. And I also really like the question about the future, by the way. I think for me personally, but I think also for many of the people that I work with, it's simply trying to establish what is the reason of someone's death or who is responsible for someone's killing. And it's usually that we feel, okay, we know someone has been killed, but either the party that witnesses say may be responsible will say, well, it's not entirely clear, or you don't really know the full picture. And it's then really trying to understand, okay, is the statements that they're saying, are they true, are they not true? Who is basically responsible for someone's death? It's usually, I think, with many of the investigations we do, what we're trying to understand. And that's, I think, what drives most of us as well. The obsessive gene, to say again, is indeed, I think, in many of us, and sometimes, I mean, you could sometimes compare it with you want to solve a puzzle, but the thing is then that you also feel like, why do you go? Why do so many people work on it and have that energy? Because you kind of want to find out. Because, yeah.
Susan, no, go, please.
I'm just going to make a counterpoint, because I was thinking about this, trying to figure out what was today going to be and how were we going to converse. And I was thinking about, because I love the work that your team does, and I really look forward to it, and I really don't dig into it maybe as deeply to even understand how you've gotten there. But I wonder, this notion of proving, and I was just, as I was thinking about what you're doing and the verification, the authentication, all of these big words we know and the urgency of that, and why it is that I didn't, my instinct when I found the body on the hillside was not to why didn't I try to figure out who did it, right? And so I left it at, I have to make this image. And I assumed the image would have a kind of power in some notion back to future that I couldn't predict, to where it would even live, if it ever would be reproduced. But somehow I'm interested in that.
Maybe it's the documentary versus the investigation, right?
Yeah, though when I work with journalists, which is the difference. I mean, when I was working with the New York Times, we document the Mosote massacre. There was a writer who wrote. It was front page. There is that time. Mm-hmm. But there's something also about where you set your limits of what it is you're contributing somehow in relation to, and that's what makes it so interesting to me, because there's a very strong collaborative team. And you're working collaboratively, we're working semi-solo. So maybe there's something in that where we set limits of possibility.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because it really shows the bias and sort of how we tell stories, and sort of how we rely on language to sort of inform the gaps between any sensorial or material evidence that we're encountering. But also this sort of, it reminds me of the sort of deep ocular centrism of our society, that we rely so much on vision and visuality to be convinced of some form of truth. And how do we sort of like move away from that and think about other forms of knowledge and transmission?
Very good. And it leads me to what, sorry, is going to be the last question, because we've gotten to the end of our evening. But I'm going to ask you, what kind of sources of truth can we trust? Is there even such a thing?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know it's big. Yeah, I know.
I mean, I guess I do think about that, and like just this idea of the absolute. Like, wouldn't it just be wonderful? And isn't that at some level sort of what we're all after? Like something that we can feel is so true and so trustworthy that we can just kind of attach ourselves to it, almost like a barnacle. I feel like it's just a
barnacle. Yeah.
I just, and so much of kind of what we believe, even as a scientist, like there's so much of like identity that comes into looking, and we can say, oh, we're so objective, and I read a paper, but I don't go reconstruct the experiment. I trust that it was done in a way that made that outcome, like I think that it can be really, really hard to sort of find that, something that we can really stake everything on.
Yeah, as usual, these salons never get you to any conclusions or anything that you can attach yourself to, like a barnacle. That's going to be, I'm going to make myself a T-shirt and also a doll, like a barnacle attached. But I just want to thank these amazing panelists very much. And I want to thank also the video makers. And I want to thank Christina Mouchot for a wonderful evening. And I want to thank you for coming prepared and reading the whole list of references, as you always do. And, well, I want to give you a gigantic round of applause. You're wonderful. Thank you so much. And now, as usual, we have our so-so snacks and our mediocre wine, so we can keep on talking. And, that's the best time. So thank you very much again. See you at the next salon and outside. Yes. Thanks.